Hi, I'm Anna. I'm from here. Where's here? The Blue Ridge, part of the Greater Appalachian Mountains. Is that relevant? It will be. Long story short, I'm a game developer, and I've accidentally found myself as a voice on labor issues in the absolute dumpster fire that is the games industry these days, and I've had a lot of people ask me questions about it. The thing about labor issues here in the United States, even when they're dealing with something as high-tech as video games, is that it's informed by more than a century of hard-fought, literally bloody history that brought us to this point. And part of the reason why organizing the games industry has been so difficult is that a lot of that history has been purposefully omitted from curricula, and bodies like unions have been disadvantaged both from a government standpoint and in the public eye. And who's responsible for that? Put a pin in that too. Yeah, we got a lot to cover. Thankfully, I'm from the mountains and a member of a union, and I also got an A in AP US history. So here's a rapid-fire 1,000-yard summary of labor in the United States and what it has to do with the current issues plaguing the games industry. Okay, let's get going. I got a long way to go. Chapter 1, Slavery. So, unfortunately, we do kind of have to start here. I know it's awkward and no one likes talking about it, but it's kind of a historical fact that for much of this country's early history, much of the labor and industry was carried out by enslaved people. And if saying that makes me woke, this is probably going to be a really long video for you. Specifically, let's start at the end of the institution of slavery, abolition. The 13th Amendment was ratified by Congress on January 31st, 1865, which abolished slavery in the United States, except if you're a prisoner. However, many slave owners weren't too keen on the concept of suddenly not having a workforce and simply didn't tell their slaves that they were free now. Yeah. It wasn't until June 19th of 1865 that the very last enslaved people were informed of their freedom in Galveston, Texas. This day is now celebrated as Juneteenth to truly mark the end of chattel slavery. Or was it? Chapter 2, Reconstruction and the Sharecropping Era. The Civil War left America functionally a disaster. The country was literally Frankensteining itself back together. Approximately 620,000 men had died as casualties of the war itself. Millions of now free Black Americans had nowhere to go, and the nation was basically economically devastated. Oh yeah, and to top it all off, President Lincoln was assassinated while just trying to watch a play. So, as you might imagine, the era that followed was equally as messy. Welcome to Reconstruction. Reconstruction was an opportunity to rebuild the country from the ground up, to make an equitable society where people, regardless of race, gender, class, or cultural background, were able to thrive. And did we take that opportunity? Take a wild guess. The Reconstruction era was notoriously botched, though botched might be too kind of a word. Depending on who you ask, some say Reconstruction was purposefully kneecapped to prevent former slaves, poor whites, and women from ever getting ahead. And that's not even including the wrongs done to indigenous people. It was a mess. Depending on your view, it was an accidental or intentionally designed mess. And hey, I've already introduced one bit in this video, so why not a second one? On our list of why is thing like that in modern America? Option A, we botched Reconstruction. We'll get to option B later. The Reconstruction Acts were passed under President Andrew Johnson. This was the legal basis under which states loyal to the Confederacy were to be admitted back into the USA. There were lots of things covered within these acts, but one of the big ones was the economy. The South had much of the agricultural industry, and due to the abolition of slavery and the many war casualties removing otherwise healthy workers from the workforce, things needed to get kick-started again, and fast. The large plantations that had previously been worked by slaves couldn't afford to just shut down. Prior to the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, Union General Sherman promised that the land owned by slave-holding whites in the South was to be seized, broken up into smaller plots, and redistributed to formerly enslaved people of the South. This order, known as Field Order 15, entitled formerly enslaved families to Take It Away, Kendrick.
40 acres in the mule. This is bigger than the music.
But then Lincoln was assassinated and Andrew Johnson was like, no. So what did they do instead? Feudalism! AKA slavery too. Basically, the plantation owners who got to keep their land were like, no, guys, it's okay. You can stay here and still work the fields, but as free people. It's feudalism, okay? It's just feudalism. This was referred to as sharecropping. Now freed Black Americans in the South still worked the fields, but now had to pay a portion of their grown crops to the landowners as the rent for using their land. This basically resulted in debt slavery, as landowners could charge high rent rent for the land that tenants could not possibly pay. So what else could they do but offer future crops as collateral? Basically, it's just slavery again, okay? This section is depressing, but it's important because it informs what comes next. Chapter 3, The Gilded Age. This one's really long, sorry. Freed slaves who managed to leave the South, displaced Native Americans, and poor whites with little economic or social standing had been slowly inching their way toward the west coast of the United States for decades at this point. But the abolition of slavery and access to more natural resources in the American frontier meant that the Industrial Revolution, which had already begun in Europe, was about to hit American soil. And there were a lot of people needing work because this was also the start of large-scale immigration to the United States. Welcome to the Gilded Age. A lot of people needed work, and newly minted factory owners were ready to hire the masses, all while making millions, while the workers made pennies. Sound familiar? The term Gilded Age was actually coined by American writer Mark Twain. The term refers to what Encyclopedia Britannica describes as the flashy materialism and overt political corruption of the era. It was a time of massive economic, social, and political change for the United States, and much of it was facilitated by rapid industrialization, which instituted massive change for the nature of American work. Establishment of a federal bank also meant that people could secure capital to build their factory empires. And unlike the craft of small artisans or agriculture that relied on specific seasons, factories could reliably produce products year-round. And this meant that people had to get paid differently. Factory workers traded their labor for material wages from their employers in standard intervals, such as hourly or by-shift wages. And these wages were terrible. But seeing as the work was consistent and there wasn't a lot of other options in some areas, it was a trade that workers basically had to make. Factory work was notoriously awful. With no established labor laws or safety standards yet, factories were crowded, dangerous places to work. Children were commonly preferred as factory workers, as their small fingers and stature meant that they could literally crawl inside of machinery in order to fix it. Some of the images from this time are truly haunting. Additionally, crowded, dirty factories were a perfect vector for disease like tuberculosis and typhoid, which both exploded during this period, as antibiotics wouldn't be discovered until 1928. Other unsafe production practices, like exposure to harmful chemicals or methods, also caused serious damage to the people of this era. Great! The book The Jungle by Upton Sinclair is considered one of the most influential works of literature from this period. Sinclair went deep into the underbelly of the Chicago meatpacking world in order to expose the regular horrors and human rights violations therein. Investigative journalism really also boomed during this time, and unfortunately there was no shortage of things to report on. This book was so influential that it led President Roosevelt to start to crack down on the meatpacking industry and industrial industries at large. Another highly influential event of this time that you likely learned about in high school was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in Manhattan in 1911. The fire killed 146 garment workers, mostly women and girls, but a few men. Most died of smoke inhalation, burns, or from attempting to jump from high windows in order to escape the blaze. The factory was not equipped with sprinkler systems, and the doors to the fire escapes had been locked by the factory owners to prevent the workers from taking unauthorized breaks. This horrific event kickstarted a wave of factory reform in New York City and would leave a lasting legacy as the pinnacle of why safety regulations are written in blood. But workers weren't going to take all this sitting down. Large-scale labor organization began the way it often does, by workers talking, agreeing that they don't like how they're being treated, the conditions of their factories, the use of child labor, low pay, long hours, basically anything. And then realizing that ultimately, the factory doesn't work without them. So why not strike? Why not refuse to work until the employer complies with their demands? This is known as collective bargaining and is a central pillar to the unionization process. Unions are literally just groups of workers. Sometimes companies will try to spin it that a union is like a third party between the workers and the employer, but that just isn't true. Workers are the union. Speaking of third parties, during this era, employers famously hired literal private enforcement groups like the Pinkertons in order to root out or intimidate organizers, spread misinformation about what unionization is, and otherwise serve as corporate police. Yeah, like those Pinkertons, like the horrible faction in Red Dead Redemption 2 Pinkertons. Like those were real people. Put a pin in that. There's some interesting vocabulary that comes out of this period that we'll need moving forward, so get your notepads out. Activity performed by groups like the Pinkertons is referred to as union busting. This activity can come from both the employer themselves or from those outside groups. A tangential activity is scabbing. When workers are striking, employers will often try to hire additional people to just go in and work in their place. These people who take jobs from striking workers are known as scabs. And being a scab back in the day could literally get you beat up in the town square. The action of working as a scab is sometimes described as crossing a picket line. Basically, you're willing to walk right past striking workers in order to get your own bag. But it's not just scabs that can cross a picket. When workers are striking, it's encouraged that consumers not purchase anything from the employer either. But if you know the workers are striking and buy a product anyway, that's also called crossing a picket line. Basically, what scabs and crossing a picket line have in common is a lack of solidarity. Solidarity is a labor term that basically means you agree and stand with the striking workers, even if you don't work with them or even in that same industry. Solidarity as a concept has almost entirely died in our current era, but back then it was the thing that made unionization happen in the United States. This one is huge and we'll definitely be back to it. Chapter 4. The Coal Wars and the Rise of Unions. If you thought factories were the only places where exploitative wage labor was having a heyday during the Gilded Age, boy howdy. Let's talk about the Coal Wars, which culturally were very far away from the glitz and glamour of the American Northeast. Remember when I said that me being from the mountains was going to be relevant? Well, here we are! With the rise of industrialization, coal could now be mined from mountainous areas of the United States, most notably the Appalachian Mountains and Colorado, at greater capacity than ever before. Now, coal can be difficult to mine and needs a significant amount of manpower in order to do it. So coal barons would employ large swaths of the population, mostly men and boys, all while paying them terrible wages. The problem is, most coal mines aren't exactly in city centers and were often out in the boonies of already rural locales. This gave rise to what's known as the company town system, where coal companies would establish a small settlement near the mine that had everything their workers could need to live there. Oh yeah, and also the employer was the landlord and owned all the businesses in the company town and basically make everything super expensive, so all of your already meager wages go directly back into the company. It sucked. And let me tell you, it didn't last. Unlike workers in the Northeast, who were fond of staging strikes and picket lines, the coal miners went for a more direct action approach, shall we say? The coal wars are called wars for a reason. Despite company town leaders trying to suppress any would-be unionizers using everything from intimidation to murder, those miners were going to be treated better, gosh dang it. This led to several battles or armed labor conflicts in the region, such as the famous Battle of Blair Mountain in 1921, where 10,000 armed coal miners fought 3,000 lawmen and scabs for a total of 5 days. Federal troops were finally brought in to squash the uprising, which toppled decades of coal miner attempts at unionization, but ultimately would lead President Roosevelt to make some real regulatory changes due to the terrible conditions endured by the miners. It's at this point you've probably heard about how unions were the compromise between industry owners and workers, and this is why. Labor movements have been cropping up all over the country as workers were tired of being exploited, but armed conflicts? This was too much. Roosevelt had to do something about this, and the Great Depression after the market crash of 1929 gave him just the opportunity. Enter the New Deal. This cornerstone of the Roosevelt administration consisted of a series of domestic programs, work projects, and reforms that aimed to help get America out of the Great Depression. One of the critical things it did was benefit unions. The National Labor Relations Act of 1935, also known as the Wagner Act, I don't know if it said Wagner, but I'm going to say Wagner because I was an opera student, okay? Let me live. This act established federal law that secures the right of private sector employees to organize into unions, engage in collective bargaining, and enact strikes. It also established the National Labor Relations Board, which Elon Musk thinks is unconstitutional. Put a pin in that too. Chapter 5. The mid-20th century, Hollywood, and the golden age of unions. There's a thing you'll sometimes hear about the 1950s that the right wing wants to go back and live there, while the left wing wants to go back and work there. Now that joining a union was legally protected, it became easier and more popular than ever to make and join one. The post-war economic boom meant that America was raking in the cash, and this also helped perpetuate the baby boom. There was also further standardization of union affairs with the Labor Management Reporting and Disclosure Act of 1959 after a whole thing with the Teamsters, who could probably get a whole video just on themselves. According to the Pew Research Center, the density or percentage of workers belonging to a union peaked in 1954 at 35%, whereas the highest total number of union members peaked in 1979 at a whopping 21 million. America really was booming. The rise of the auto industry mirrored this trend, and the 8-hour, 9-to-5 work shift with good regular wages and benefits became popular due to the practices of the Ford Motor Company, which all other companies would would start to emulate in order to attract workers. The campaign for a standard 8-hour workday was well underway, but it wasn't until Ford actually instituted it and other factories were losing out on workers that it became standard by sheer necessity. But a win is a win, am I right? Now, if there's one place that is historically critical to understand in relation to the modern games industry, it's Hollywood. Now, usually, video games are fighting for legitimacy in their own right, independent of our film and TV brethren, but weirdly enough, this is like the one area that we should be looking to Hollywood for inspiration, and we aren't. Anyway, Hollywood is one of the most consistently unionized industries these days, but it wasn't always that way. In fact, it was once organized very similarly to the modern games industry. This was known as the studio system, sometimes known as the tentpole system. Basically, large production studios like MGM or Paramount would hire their own set of workers to staff and work on all of the productions and run their movie theaters. Because yeah, they also used to be able to own their own movie theaters. If you wanted to watch a movie that was made by Paramount, you'd have to go to a Paramount specific movie theater. It's giving streaming wars. Naturally, the heads of studios were gonna do what capitalists do. They're gonna give terrible pay for unsafe working conditions and long hours, such as the infamous 25-hour shoots. The unionization push really kicked off in 1933 when the major studios announced a 50% cut to already meager wages, citing the Great Depression. Hey, is this sounding familiar to anyone? Naturally, to set people off, Hollywood didn't protest and unionize all at once. It happened in small bursts, starting with craftspeople like those who build sets, and would come around to writers and eventually actors and directors. Strikes occurred on and off throughout the 1940s, and then the Red Scare happened. Basically, everyone thought they were playing Among Us with communists nationwide as a reaction to the Cold War. The House Un-American Activities Committee, which was a real thing, was determined to find and root out all communists in Hollywood, and unionization, based on its focus on workers and their rights, was seen as potentially communist activity. The Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 required union officials to swear that they were not communist, and bodies like the Screen Actors Guild made all members swear similarly. Like, this stuff was silly. Unions would continue to battle it out with studios under the studio system until 1948 with the case of the United States versus Paramount Pictures, which declared that it was illegal for major film productions to also own movie theaters because it would create an unfair monopoly. This type of legislation is referred to as antitrust law, which is a type of legislature that protects this kind of fair competition within the economic market. It basically prevents monopolies. These first start popping up in the wake of the Gilded Age, where everyone was speedrunning building unethical monopolies over essential materials like steel. US versus Paramount was basically the nail in the coffin for the studio system. Now, people who work in film are essentially individuals under a guild and are hired to work on specific projects. Strikes have continued off and on as capitalists keep trying to capitalism, but ultimately Hollywood has remained a quote-unquote union town. In the mid-20th century, though, America was basically a union town. This is why the left wing wants to go back and work in the 1950s. This is why people could buy starter homes on a single income, and the trend continued into the 1970s. So what happened? Chapter 6, Ronald Reagan. Well, let's get that multiple choice card out again. Let me get the Barbie voice on. Why is thing like that in modern America? Option A, we botched Reconstruction. Option B, Ronald Reagan. And then for all you absolute sickos playing along at home, we'll also introduce option C, which is a combination of options A and B. Look, I know I made this video about labor, but there's a terrifying amount of stuff in the modern day that can be traced back to like these three options. So sorry for ruining your week. Ronald Reagan was regrettably the 40th president of the United States, and he was basically the president during all of the 1980s because he served 2 terms for some reason. He did a lot to disempower unions and basically paved the way for a second Gilded Age, which is messed up because he literally served as the president of the Screen Actors Guild for a while before becoming the president of the United States. Unions for me, but not for thee, I guess. I should also note, while SAG president, Ronald Reagan attempted to throw multiple of his fellow actors under the bus by telling the FBI that they were communist sympathizers during the Red Scare. Really cool of you, buddy. His lack of solidarity came to a head in 1981 when the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization went on strike. However, there's a federal law on the books that government unions weren't allowed to go on strike because it would impair day-to-day function of the country. So Reagan just threatened to fire all of them if they didn't return to work in 48 hours because it was an illegal strike. And is this sounding really familiar to anyone else? Basically, like 12,000 air traffic controllers just didn't return and they were fired. So Reagan made it clear that he had no sympathy for striking workers, and the number of strikes and all-around union activity would begin to fall in the 1980s. And don't even get me started on trickle-down economics and tax cuts for the rich. The only solidarity the guy had was with the ultra-wealthy. Anyway, Chapter 7. The rise of the video game industry. Video games became an actual industry in the last third of the 20th century. Projects were initially small and could be made with even just a couple of people. There were no rules, regulations, AAA companies, nothing. What, do you think there was going to be like crunch discourse regarding the production of Pong? Like, get real. There was, however, crunch. Basically, from the very start of the industry, overwork had been present. 1996's Tomb Raider reportedly had 15-hour days, 7 days a week. Industry icon John Romero famously said that the hours at id Software were, quote, 10 a.m. until we were done. And you might be like, why? Well, it's a few things. Games used to have to ship using literal discs, and those had to go out for shipping at a certain time in order to literally make it onto shelves. These days, where releases are primarily digital, there isn't as much of an issue with that. And back then, they were also just much worse at estimating how long things would take as the industry was newer. However, as time went on, crunch became as much a socio-cultural feature of the industry as much as anything. Working unreasonable hours for no extra pay was just the expectation. California state legislation even made specific legal loopholes so game companies wouldn't have to pay overtime to their salaried employees in order to keep the game companies happy within the Golden State rather than risk them seeking out less expensive locales. Another awful thing started to happen in the 1990s. Game companies started to go public. Once it was clear that these video games weren't some flash-in-the-pan novelty, modern-day giants like Activision and Ubisoft started opening up shares of their company to investors. Shareholder capitalism had officially reached the digital age. And it was basically about to make almost everything about video games worse. Chapter 8. Modern game industry problems. Okay, so this is actually where I stopped writing my script because I've been sitting on this video for like so long and I edited the script like so many times. And ultimately, when it came to describing all of the issues that the industry faces today, like the sense of dread and like nausea when it comes to like putting it all down on paper was I couldn't do it. I don't know why. It just anyway, so we have no script for this section and the following section, which is the last section. So you're here with me. We're raw dogging it. I do have a couple bullet points though, just because like I need something to keep me on track because I have a Sagittarius stellium, so like I will literally yap forever. So let me get a sip of water real quick. Okay, so we were talking about crunch. So crunch still happens in the games industry. There's a lot more awareness of it now. Like even player bases are knowledgeable about crunch, and players honestly are like, hey, be nice to your workers, which like, thanks guys, you're so real for that. But the thing about crunch is like, since it started in like the 1990s within the industry, there have been lots of studies from very reputable bodies that have shown that not only is crunch like bad for morale, it actually makes you way less good at your job. So there's literally no reason for it. And there's actually a lot of studios now that are like anti-crunch. They say that they don't crunch. Sometimes though, they actually do still crunch, but they say like, oh, well, it's not like mandatory, but like it's like expected of you and you still don't get paid for it. So like they say that they're not a crunch studio, but they actually are. So keep an eye out for that. However, people are generally more knowledgeable about things like crunch and burnout, which is good that people are knowledgeable, but a lot of people still just kind of consider it like the cost of doing business. But I really think that, especially since the pandemic, which is like, we'll get to that, but I think people are starting to really change. So with the pandemic, the wheels were starting to fall off the games industry even before the pandemic, but I do think that the pandemic changed everything. So basically, because they were terrified of the economy basically collapsing, money became cheap. Like there was very little, like the interest rates were super low. And so people were lending money. Video games had previously been seen as like quote unquote like recession proof, essentially, which meant that like even during like the 2008 Great Recession, people still bought video games because it's kind of like they call it the lipstick index. It's like when people can't afford big purchases like homes or new cars, they are still willing to splurge, but the definition of a splurge becomes very different, right? So like for a lot of women, they joke that like women, they won't go out and like buy a new dress, but they might buy a new shade of lipstick. You know, it's that little indulgence. So video games kind of fill that niche. Well, during the pandemic, video games were exploding because everyone was freaking stuck at home, right? We were all stuck at home and we all needed something to do. And so basically, video games were selling like crazy good, especially during the first part of the pandemic. And basically, all of these investors, whether they were like private equity groups, even just like classic shareholders, I guess, through the general stock market, they started investing mega into the games industry. And so it kind of exploded. You'd see a lot of new studios spinning up. Like it's usually like, oh, studio made by veterans of like Riot and Naughty Dog and Bungie. Like it's usually like big names, right? And you'll see like the press releases from this time were kind of crazy because they were like, oh, this studio that was made by like some veterans from like a couple of game studios magically was able to acquire like millions and millions and millions of dollars of investment. And it was a lot of us were like very skeptical at the time. And a lot of these studios either no longer exist, even though, you know, it's been 5 years since that, whether like the entire studio collapsed or like they just got consolidated. It's hard to say. It also was really interesting to see like who was getting the funding during this time, because a lot of the times, yeah, it was just these big names. And like there was that one studio that announced that famously like the only woman on staff was a dog. Anyway, so then you also had these big groups that would come in and acquire studios. Like the classic one is Embracer. This is a Swedish group that just bought like every single studio like under the sun. Like they like Tencent and Embracer, like they just went on like a shopping spree in the games industry and they bought all of these studios. The problem is that unlike a lot of other industries, games, like you're not going to get a quick return on investment. Like that's just not how it works here. Games take a long time to make, especially AAA games. Like there are AAA games in production right now that have been in production for like 10 years. Ask me how I know. Anyway, it was really difficult for these companies to start justifying these costs to their shareholders who were like, why aren't we getting our return on investment? Especially as the economy started to like do weird things a couple of years after the start of the pandemic. Anyway, so Embracer famously like shut down a ton of studios, laid people off. You'll also see that that's happening with other large studio entities. EA is a classic example of that. They have a lot of studios making a lot of games and they poured a ton of money into these studios. But then when the shareholders are like, where's our return on investment? We need that number to go up. Things start getting really dicey. So basically the shareholders want to see improved growth year over year. The concept of shareholder capitalism is so ridiculous to me because basically what it means is that shareholders want to have bought low to sell high. And that basically means that every single year there has to be growth in the business. That's not sustainable, right? That's just not really possible. These studios, without having produced any video games, because games take a long time to make, they start looking at how they can cut corners in order to increase or artificially boost their numbers to please their shareholders. So what are they going to do? They're going to close studios and claim that they are streamlining. They're going to lay off workers and claim that it's streamlining their workforce. It's corporate greed. Like, I think a lot of the time people are really quick to reach for like a political reason for why a game studio isn't doing well. And I understand that's incendiary, right? And that it's an easy finger to point, but I don't think we're pointing the fingers at the right people. The issue is not that a studio is quote unquote woke. The issue is that the execs and the C-suites are never the ones who are getting laid off. The issue is that the shareholders want continued growth year over year. They don't care about the art. They don't care about the quality of the game. They want money. They don't care about games as a medium. They want their money and they want it now. And they don't care how many lives they have to ruin, how many incredible games get sacrificed on the altar of profits, right? Like they want their money. It is killing the games industry. It is. Now, the problem is that when you lay off all of your workers, there aren't enough people to actually make the video games. Or they lay off a staff person who has things like benefits, like a health insurance and a 401k. And they're like, oh crap, we do still need someone to do that job. So we're going to lay off the full-timer and we're going to hire someone. Usually that'd be a contractor, right? Which is, I mean, that's like me. It's like a freelancer. Because usually that means that the studio doesn't have to pay benefits to a person. And overall, we're actually cheaper on the whole. What you see on top of all of these layoffs is basically these companies trying to turn game developers into gig workers rather than giving them, you know, what I described with the Ford Motor Company, which is, you know, your standard work environment with healthy benefits. Instead, they want to go back to how things were in the Gilded Age, where everyone was an individual. They didn't have to provide anything to the worker. The wages have actually gone down. Like, if you look at the hourly listing of like contractors, there's a lot of studios that in some states now you do have to post what the actual earning band is, like California, Washington, and a couple of others. And when you look at the hourly salary and you like do the typical calculations, like they're paying people less to do the same job without the same benefits. They are cutting corners and it is destroying the games industry and it's making worse quality games. You can't make consistently good games without a team that's been working together, that has institutional knowledge. And a lot of the times now, they're not even bringing on contractors. Like, if the studio is like based in California, they might not even be bringing on contractors like from the US because we are expensive, right? Like labor is expensive. Recently, like a lot of companies have been popping up in Poland, or they have satellites like in Poland. Like usually, like it used to like just be CDPR was over there, but now there's like other studios there, and it's because labor is cheaper. You see the rise of things like outsourcing, where studios might outsource their QA or their localization rather than having those services be in-house because it's cheaper. They can outsource where they don't have to pay benefits and they can pay less. And a lot of times these people aren't even properly credited. So, and here's the thing. Here's the thing that they're counting on. By creating this culture of churn and turbulence within the games industry, those executives, the C-suites, the suits, right? The people at the top, they're counting on the fact that studios can't organize because in order to get a union at a place of work, you have to have what's called like an election. So everyone has to get together, all of the workers, and they basically have to vote on if they think they want to join the union or not. It's a lot harder for people to do a union campaign at a place of work if they're constantly laying people off, if there's constantly a threat of losing your job, right? So they are counting on the fact that not only can they cut these corners in order to make their number go up for their shareholders, it makes it a lot harder for people to get a foothold when it comes to organizing. So that has been a real struggle. Now, there are places that are doing it, right? I think like Bethesda is wall to wall. I think Blizzard is making really big strides. They were one of the first people to really get going. We've also seen a rise in co-ops and other new structures that are basically worker-owned game studios. So everyone who works there is like a partial owner, and then they basically make decisions together. Co-ops have like that's a whole video on itself. Basically, the tide is turning. I never want to like all of this is really awful, right? If you're in the games industry and you're watching this, you know it. We all know it. I think of the story of like my older sibling was staying with me while they were in town for like a work thing. And I woke up and I think it was Crystal Dynamics that had layoffs. And I was just like, Crystal Dynamics did layoffs this morning. And my sibling just looked at me and was like, is this how you live? Like every morning you wake up and you check your phone and 50 to 100 people are out of a job and you constantly now have to message your friends to see if they have the ability to sustain their families. Like, is this how you live? And the answer is yes. We have lived this way in the games industry for the past 5 years, maybe longer, at least 5 years. We love video games. We entered this industry to make video games, but it doesn't take a genius to know that you have to have all of your needs met in order to make good art. The concept, right, of the like suffering, like miserable artist is a myth, right? You can't make good art if you're constantly worried about where your next meal is going to come from, or if you're going to have a job in a month, right? It's been really hard making games under these conditions, and I think everyone sees that. Like industry, a lot of us aren't happy with our work. Players might not be happy with our work. You have games that have been in development hell for a decade. And it's all just because of mismanagement. It's all just mismanagement. But I never want to leave you on a depressing note. So that is why the very last chapter of this video is chapter 9. What now? So there's 2 bullet points I have jotted down for this. Only 2, so we're almost done, I promise. And one of them is unionize. When it comes to the games industry, we can't let this keep happening. But like I said, the people at the top are counting on the fact that with this turbulent environment, we can't get a foothold. Well, that's why things are changing. So I mentioned at the top of this video that I am actually a member of a union. I am a member of United Video Game Workers, CWA, which is part of the Communication Workers of America. And we are a new union that announced in March of 2025 at GDC. And our union is for all video game workers in both the United States and Canada. So it's for most of North America. Now, the thing that's going to make this union stand out, there are other unionization efforts that have been cropping up throughout the games industry, especially in the past like 10-ish years. Things like Game Workers United and IATSE, which typically is like theater workers. They've also made some major strides, as well as CODE CWA, which is the Campaign to Organize Digital Employees with the Communication Workers of America. The thing that's really unique about United Video Game Workers is it's called a direct-to-join union. You'll remember I mentioned there were lots of pieces of legislation, like in the 40s, that made it easier to form a union. And that's what standardized the like election process that I mentioned as well. Now, the thing is, before that was the standard, all unions were direct to join. So in order to join a union, all you had to do was like fill out a form. All you had to do was basically show up. And that's how things worked for a really long time. And especially now that the National Labor Relations Board is under threat from the current administration. Like I said, Elon Musk thinks that the National Labor Relations Board is somehow unconstitutional, despite the fact that it like definitely isn't. With that under threat, it's important that even in the case that the NLRB like gets gutted, we need to be able to protect ourselves as a union. And also we need to make it easy for everyone to join. It kind of circumvents the fact that these studios are hoping that we can't get an election. So everyone can join, an individual. So I'm a freelancer, for example, and I joined. Anyone can. You can be staff at a studio. You can be a freelancer or even like a contractor through a vendor, right? We have like students who are part of UBW. We want to make a video game industry that works. Games are made by people. You can't make really good games if you don't take good care of your people. And it's past time that the games industry started doing that. It's past time. So whether you are a game worker who is watching this, or you're a student, or you're a hobbyist, or even you're just interested in games, right? You're not a game dev at all, but you like video games. You're just a player. Please look up United Video Game Workers. Learn about who we are, what we're about, because what we need is your solidarity. So coming back to the concept of solidarity, since 2014, when quote unquote Gamergate happened, there has been an attitude that developers and players are at odds. And I cannot stress how much that should be the opposite. Because here's the thing, people at the top, they are very, very content to let players and their own devs fight it out. Like studios, they don't really say anything when there's fighting between players and devs, because if we're fighting each other, we can't go, hey, why did you lay off 500 workers? Why did this game flop? And you laid off 500 workers and then you gave the executive a multi-million-dollar bonus. What's that about? The more we fight each other, the more we don't have solidarity with each other, we can't actually fix anything. If we're fighting each other, we can't realize that the ultimate root cause is one and the same, and it's the suits, right? So even if you're a player, I really encourage you to look into the working conditions in the games industry, because we need to have solidarity, because we need your help, right? As devs, we need your help to say, hey, we deserve better working conditions so that we can make better games for you guys. And the people who are stopping us from doing that, it's not the woke. Okay? It's the execs. It's the shareholders. It's the people at the top. So consider joining UVW if you're a game dev. Reach out to me if you've got questions. And players, there's a reason why the main goal in a game is to beat the boss. Thank you so much for watching. Solidarity forever. And sorry this video was so long.